My biggest
Before
obsession since grad school was about figuring out how to turn offices into housing. It's just such a simple and yet complex proposition that it blew my mind. Yeah,
this was before COVID, right? Yeah,
this is pre-COVID. It was just before it.
you're like you're predicting the future.
I was totally predicting.
Yeah, I told you.
I totally
Oracle is here.
The Oracle was there, presented his thesis about, how office is basically fucked and what we could do about it.
Most Modern Podcast, Season 3, Episode 5. Yair Titelboim, Data Scientist at Hines Office of Innovation. Hello, Mopo is back. Another season, another episode. We have today Yair Titelboim. He spearheads the transformative venture-driven initiatives at Hines, based in Houston. For the listeners, Hines is a global real estate development company that has offices all around the world, including in North America, Europe, and Asia. And Hines is headquartered in Houston, actually. Yair has a background in architecture, city planning, and data science. Welcome, Yair. Thanks for joining Mopo today.
Glad to be here, guys.
So you started your career as an architect in Israel, and then you made a big transition to becoming a real estate data scientist working in Houston. Can you tell us a little more about your early career journey, how you made the transition, and then you also studied at MIT, so some story would be good to tell us there.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, so I'm like what you would say probably mid-career, right? I've started really working as an architect in about 2012. In Israel, we do things a little more slowly because we serve in the military and stuff like that. So, of course, I did that too. And then, I studied architecture, which you guys, I think, all know is pretty great. Other people around me did computer science, and I felt like I had a much better time than they did. Plus, way more girls, which is also like how I met my wife, literally, in architecture school. So, really awesome. Then I actually worked in Tel Aviv. So we built this crazy building. My first project was like winning this giant competition around like how to do parametric design for facades, right? And so we came up with this concept of like a cloud, which back then, Rhino and like doing that stuff with like, toggles and Grasshopper was like the best thing. It's 20 years old technology at this point, but it was very exciting at the time. And so that project actually got built, which I'm extremely proud of, but it is very far from what I think most of us kind of imagined when this was a competition. It's a large school in the middle of Tel Aviv. It's a really interesting project called the Checkpoint Building. If you ever are in Israel, I recommend looking at, or at least, getting an idea of what that is. But then...
What was the firm named?
So the firm is Kimel Eshkolot. It's this interesting like boutique, maybe 12 people office based in Tel Aviv in this like beautiful area next to Jaffa. And so I used to start every day surfing, in the beach, and then the office was right there. Like,
Sounds amazing.
Wow. It was amazing. Best time ever. Tel Aviv, even now, it's still great. But then my wife actually said, hey, guess what? I got accepted to MIT. And so my response was, what's MIT? We're in Israel. What are you even talking about? And so after she explained that and, told me that we're going, so I should get yes to that idea, which I did pretty quick. So we moved and I started at Elkus, which is this really large firm in the middle of Boston. In the
Elkus Manfredi.
Elkus Manfredi, that's the firm. And so my wife was the first one to go to MIT. She got a Smarts Urbanism degree, which is a very international kind of program, runs for 2 years. Super strong again for like internationals. And then when she graduated, I did 2 years, right, of a tour at Elkus by that time. And at that time, I thought, okay, this is Yair time, right? We did 2 years of Dalia time. Dalia time was MIT time. Yair was there to support and like, help maintain things while Dalia is getting her master's at MIT. That's huge, right? It's also a great way to start a marriage where, you sacrifice. That's a good way to set it up for the next 20. At least that's what I thought.
If Dalia agrees to that.
Right, totally. So at that point, 2 years in, I said, it's Yair time, let's go. We found this super cool project in Houston. So this local developer bought a huge piece of land in the middle of downtown Houston called The Post. This was, God, it's 16 acres total. It's huge.
The
It's
post
this
office, right?
post office. It's an
Yeah.
iconic building, right? And they actually won that in a competition. Got the the rights to develop that project from the city, and they bought it in 2015, and they won it over Hines, right? So Hines competed and lost, which doesn't happen that often in Houston.
Mhm.
So these guys got it, and what I would consider my biggest win during that time working for these guys in Houston is getting them ownership to understand that they should hire OMA and not Gensler.
OMA comes here again.
Again, and I actually think this is the perfect place to talk about that and what that means, because you guys actually know OMA a lot better than I do, but I got to work with some pretty sharp people from OMA. And I don't know if you know, but Gensler actually did a very similar project in Chicago. Again, the post office. It's like a
I
huge
see.
HQ for Uber.
Mhm.
Very, very similar project, bigger actually than the one in Houston. So ownership here clearly, thought, or it was an easy proposition for them to get Gensler to do it. But OMA just crushed it so hard. They did such an awesome job getting the owner to be, super excited and selling it to the city. They just knocked it out of the park. Really, you could see a giant gap in talent between what Gensler was doing at the time and OMA. You all were probably there at the time. I don't know if you had worked with, I think his name's Jason.
Jason Long. Yeah, no, I think
Yeah.
it was right after I had left. But it was quite impressive sort of what they were able to transform and also to get it built pretty quickly.
Yeah. Well, that's
Pretty
the excitement that these architecture firms bring.
Can
The
you
creativity.
maybe go a little deeper into like the difference that you saw? Because I think, for probably someone who's not well steeped in the in architecture, Gensler and OMA are both, big, wildly successful firms, but there is a big difference between the work between the two. So from the I guess the client side, like what was the difference that you saw?
That's a good point, right? Because the client side, so I would say like the service side, right? When you're the architect, you're on the service side, or when you transition to like Hines, or at this point was the Lou family, love it. So this is a much smaller firm, but it's different, right? Because your ownership, so your responsibility is different. You represent a lot more constraints, which is better, I think, for somebody who needs more structure on how to make decisions. Because when we're designing, right, a lot of times it's not about the constraints, because those are like pretty clear. But for ownership, it's often like, there's a pro forma and you kind of need to hit that in a lot of ways. And so I thought that was a huge difference, again, client side. But you also asked about that difference, right, between what we talk about in terms of quality between the two firms, right? And so one way that is very clear to see is like, how much of the original building did you keep? That's such an interesting metric, right? Because the better architect you are, and actually the larger your ego, the more that you will want to change, right? And that's always like a bias of architects. Like, we say less is more, but how much time do we actually mean that when we design? Not that often, right? Like a lot of times it's like, and it's not always bad, right? You could do great stuff like that. Like you can, clearly, especially when there's room for it. But in this case, this is adaptive reuse, right? There's already a lot of intent there. And a giant building made of concrete. So actually, the less you do, it'll cost less too, which was very important. So OMA really figured out how to leave more. That was what was brilliant. The other part that was brilliant is Gensler kind of designed, not just them, by the way, a lot of architects. We had a huge competition. Almost all kind of drew where the site is, and then only focused what's going on inside that box. What OMA came and did, and it was a great visual. They took a rake, and they drew a rake over the property, right? So it almost like, you could think about it as a grid, right? That's clearly it. They connected the building, which was, this is Houston, so there's a lot of roads. They propositioned this grid that will literally, eat into the building. It's gorgeous. It's also super smart to show it with a rake. And then the whole purpose of it becomes, how do we connect it better to the city, and how do we get people to the roof? Because the biggest thing about this project is its roof, and it becomes this piece of, the city in a way. It's a giant park. It is one of the largest in North America. It actually is pretty spectacular now, and it's, I think, second or third year. And that was a big deal, like how to do that properly, how to do it when, again, it's not just contained to a box, but it's a lot more connected to what's going on around it. Now, did they get to do exactly what they want? No, of course not. One of the super cool ideas was to actually dig a tunnel from the building that would go to the bayou. So if you think about Houston as a section, the bayou is the lowest, right? Then there's like downtown a little higher. And then there's other neighborhoods which are even above that, right? And so all the water, when it rains here, and rains a lot, all goes to the bayou. And the post office is exactly in the middle, right? It's a little bit above the bayou. So we thought, how cool would it be if we dig in and connect to that water system? And there's also like a pedestrian rail, right on the bayou. Best idea ever. I think, one of the greatest things that they offered, and of course it's impossible to do. Yes, it will flood in a second, right? Like it's just never going to work. But the fact that they thought about it,
big, hairy, audacious goals. There's a lot of them, and then are even more extreme. So
there's more extreme.
Yeah, but it's all about that idea.
Yeah.
They also wanted to do sky bridges because, of course, they did, right? But look, even if we got 10% of that, I still think it turned out really well.
Yeah, it's a great
Everybody
project.
that
Last
comes
time I was
here,
in Houston, made it a point to go. Yeah,
that's right.
Amazing.
Every time I get a visitor, first place we go is there. And I point out exactly where
Can't wait to see.
Job. Yeah, come visit.
So you're representing the client at that point, and then did you go back to school afterward?
Yes. So remember how I said that it was Yair time and Dalia time was over and it was now Yair time? Turns out I was wrong. It was still Dalia time, still the time of my wife.
Of course.
Yeah, of course, right? I should have known. But she was working with a small firm in Boston called One Architecture and Urbanism. And they had actually won this giant competition called the Big U, which I know you guys know. Is it like a massive project? Again, like this 10 years ago.
Yeah. Manhattan, yep. Hurricane Sandy resiliency, right?
That's right. That's where the money came in. And then the architects there, it was Biarke, a lot of it. That did the renderings, did a really good job. And so basically what had happened is my wife got to work on this project. So remember, Project Yair got a little deprioritized in Houston, and the work was about New York. So our compromise was for me to go to MIT, and that way I could be closer to New York while she's working on the Big U, basically.
Mm-hmm.
The only problem is that I'm not as smart as her, not by a long shot, so I couldn't get a full scholarship. Of course not. I did get in, but I didn't get a scholarship. I got scholarships to go somewhere else, but I ended up choosing MIT. But we couldn't really afford it because MIT is really expensive. Grad school, you guys know, is very expensive. And we took a bet, right? Like I could afford one semester. And so I said, even if I just get the one semester, still worth it. So I had to kind of be very aggressive about that first semester. And that's where I met Andrea, which, Minko and I know well. And she was really my anchor for the next maybe 5 years, where Andrea was the leader of the MIT Real Estate Innovation Lab. She was super ambitious, and basically she helped me navigate MIT and kind of stick around, work in the lab, learn a lot, and so that's how I got started at MIT.
So what at the innovation lab, what was your role? What did you work on?
It's funny. It seems like I worked on every project that the lab had. I think when I joined, it was just like 2 or 3 people, and it ended up when Minku was there. Minku, how many were we? Probably 20, maybe more. At some point, it was more.
Yeah, it grew exponentially the year after. I think when I was there, it was only about 4 or 5 people.
Yep. And it grew, and a lot of it grew around this project that we did for JLL. And that project was mainly around the hype cycle, right? Like this idea of very distinct shape that things take once they get adopted by the public. And I think JLL were really interested. Again, they're a giant brokerage, right? So they do a lot of research work, and it really fit, I think, to what they were trying to talk about at the time. Again, this is pre-COVID, pre-everything. And that work, I think, really accelerated Andrea and, what we did at MIT, which was around, trying to be super creative around like how to measure impact of technology in the industry. And the way we did this is actually very interesting. Is we took the corpus of all DSpace. You guys know what DSpace is?
No, can you explain it?
DSpace is the repository for all of the MIT thesis. So I wrote one, Minku wrote one. They all go into DSpace, and it's totally open. It's a giant corpus, and it's a really interesting one. And we did this super crude but useful potentially analysis of like how many times the technology was mentioned in this corpus. What was the first time? How quickly did that word get used more and more over time? What is the functional form of each of these, right? And JLL really liked that because, of course, you can see, how many headlines you could create based off of that. It doesn't need that serious of a science around it. But that got us really excited about what we can do. And so Andrea and I introduced this idea of let's do a course. Like, let's teach machine learning. Nobody even talked about like AI then, but we did talk a lot about natural language processing, right? That was a big thing. So no transformers, like a little bit of that, but only at the extremes. Most of it was about like prediction of maybe 10 tokens, which is, might have been the Stone Age pretty much. But we still got insights around it. And I think that's what originally got me really interested in the data science aspect of it. Again, working with Andrea on like very simple, but potentially really useful is the thing that we would talk about a lot.
At that point, were you into data science already? Did you have the tools and the techniques and the skills to deal with it, or were you picking it up on the fly?
Totally picking it up on the fly. I started with R. That was my kind of first love of learning to code. It's kind of insane right now that we get like Copilot, and I can't imagine, right, not having Copilot on my trusted left bar, and every question, is there. It's kind of amazing that I didn't have that. I could only like imagine how much faster I would pick things up. And look, I talk to like developers all day at this point, right? Almost every call I have is like we're debugging. We're in VS Code basically, which I think I couldn't have done right without trusted Copilot hanging out. Back then, none of that, right? It was like running local functions in R and learning. I mean, the basics of R is kind of incredible. It's a super incredible language. Just the bare bones of it. But at this point, I think it's like talking about ancient Hebrew, which we can talk in ancient Hebrew, a lot of ancient Hebrew, actually speak Hebrew, but it just didn't pick up, right? Not as much.
So I guess what was it about learning R and kind of getting steeped in this language and this way of doing things that really compelled you?
What I actually think I liked a lot is the fact that you could build so-called apps from it. So this idea that you could put something actually that lives on the web in a way, and you put it there, and then like people interact with it. That was super interesting to me that you could do that, because with architecture it was always like, okay, your job is, you're going to have 9 months, you're going to produce this building, it's going to be to these specs, and then things go on to the next thing. This is actually not exactly like that, because you can keep going back to it, right? It's code. So it's always there. It's actually not, most of the times it'll not be that good in its first version is also what I learned. But I think when I discovered React, is really when I got into like, okay, like there's a lot we can do, which is why Limu, when you said that you write in PHP, right? I was like, oh, right, like that's probably like writing in R at this point. Even though most of the internet is PHP, right? That's what's so cool about it. But not, I think back then, thinking through R, thinking how much of a gap there is to pick up R versus something like JavaScript, which is pretty hard to pick up, and how much easier it got once we got, TypeScript, right? Or now I'm obsessed with Tailwind, right? I learned this. I probably picked this up like the last couple weeks, but it rocked my world, right? And that brought me back to R land. Like it's the same vibe I used to get by just, trying stuff on RStudio. Feels the same way still.
So I guess, can you tell us a little bit about how labs work when it comes to, I guess, a real estate innovation lab? I guess when I think about labs at these schools, it's kind of like lab coats, you're like turning on little Bunsen burners and stuff.
No, none of that.
First of all, MIT, every department has a number of labs, isn't that right? There's something
right.
about MIT and labs that's important, I know.
Well, the whole thing about MIT, right, is the connection to industry. Like that's what set, like Princeton, even Harvard, right? Harvard's not about industry. It's actually like it's elitist in that way. MIT was always about how do we work with industry, space industry, car industry, computer science industry.
Defense.
It's that.
That's a big one, right?
It's a huge one. It's why it's there, right? But that's kind of the point. It is like an engineering school. So the labs are inherently connected to industry, which is to the point of how we did work with JLL, and to the point of like every big contract, even now in the defense point, still holds today. But this is not that kind of lab. So this lab is not like, again, a government lab. It is very much a real estate. Hines, I think, was even a contributor at that time. So it kind of did research for all these big owners and big brokers like JLL, like CBRE, which is why we got, we had the CoStar and we had RCA data. We had some data. This is not in the billions, of course, which is why I'm jealous of Libu. But it was still useful, right? Like if you wanted to do like Minku, like we wanted to do like a analysis on New York and figure out transactions over 20 years. We did that. Like that was the whole point of your research around like the value of design, which Minku did with Andrea and with a couple of other one of the smartest guys I worked with when we were there. And the whole point was it's not a big numbers game, right? They took a small sample set, probably
30,000.
Oh, 30,000. That's actually a lot bigger than I thought.
Yeah.
Still, relative to the universe of Libu, right? We're not even talking in the same order of magnitude at all. So small data set, and still you can say super interesting things. You can talk about like this building and its shape. Did this meaningfully contribute to the value of this building in a 20-year span? Does it really?
We're actually we're featuring those guys on one of the episodes.
Amazing.
It might come on before or after this episode. I'm not sure yet, but yeah.
Amazing. Tony and Helena both?
Yeah.
That's
and
amazing.
Minku Kang as well.
Well, they are two of my favorite people by far. And I'm very proud. I think I brought them in. I'm totally going to take credit. So here I go. I brought them into the lab. If I was not there.
There's Smarks.
That's right.
Smarks crew.
The Smarks crew. I was the first one. Actually, the second one. Andrea married the first one.
Right. Daniel Fink.
That's right. Who's a great guy. You should have him on too.
Yeah, you should. So it was a quite a diverse experience, and it actually almost literally made you a new person, right? Like before and after MIT, you're a whole different person. You was an architect, architectural designer, designing facades with Rhino, computational facade design, and then working with a developer on the owner's side. And then after MIT, you got into data science through this lab. And then how did you get started working at Hines?
Through a guy called Keitaro Bando, who's also a member of the lab, who's also friends with Minku, and who you should also have on the podcast because he's super smart. He's a data scientist and he works for Microsoft. And of course, he's one of my closest friends. And that's why I went to Hines, because Kitaro Bando wanted to hang out. It was not just him. There were, others. But I slept on his couch, I think, for a couple of weeks when I was actually an intern at Hines. Before I wrote my graduate thesis, I got really deep into, computing and kind of solving, I guess I would say, like more complex problem than just what we drew in a box. And so I slept on Keitaro's Bando's couch for a little bit, hung out with his dog, did an internship for Hines. Hines just launched at the time, 2019. They launched a new product called the Square. The point was to do what Adam Newman was doing, except rationally. And so it was that, though. It's a co-working product, which originally we had designed around Industrious, so a partnership with Industrious who would actually run the assets. But actually this week we've completed the contract with them. So they are no longer running Hines's Square. It's completely self-operated. And so...
So Hines was launching a WeWork type of space called the Square.
That's right.
In their assets, so in their commercial towers all over the North America and potentially Europe and Asia.
Right? Like that's still going on. So that back then we did the first one, which was in 717, Texas, right next to what is now Hines HQ, which is Texas Tower. Again, a beautiful building. But the original Square, right, a lot of it was informed by the way that WeWork thought. And I was brought in. I was actually offered a job that summer by WeWork. But the work just sounded so insane to me that I couldn't do it. I interviewed, I met with the team, and I concluded that they are, no, I don't want to be like unkind, but I just didn't understand what they were talking about. So it was actually a pretty easy decision, like work with Katro on this very clear thing about a co-working space and putting some sensors and building it out and using some computation to figure out like what the perfect size of office is, right? And how much cafeteria space you need relative to the amount of 2 or 3 unit kind of clusters, right? It's giant floor plans, maybe 30,000 square feet. So a lot, right? You could do that. I think we spent more than $2 million on just like the finishes. High-end product because this is Hines too. So nobody's, trying to save money necessarily. So it was a very easy decision. But I'm sure that if I had joined WeWork at the time, I would have had more stories, like crazier stories.
Well, 2019 is a very specific. 2019 is a very specific year, not only for co-working but also for WeWork.
Yep.
And I think what's interesting is like pandemic really hit co-working hard. Like Notel went under, Industrious got acquired by CBRE. So I guess like what was it about Hines' Square that survived through the pandemic and is now still kind of an ongoing product and maybe more successful than it was ever before?
It is more successful than ever before. But it's part of a much larger ship, right? It's not its own thing. It's part of management services, which is actually a pretty low margin business compared to pure development. And so I think at this point, there's maybe 10 squares, right? How many did WeWork do? Like they did 10 every 30 minutes, right? Was that probably?
It's hundreds.
Oh, I don't. But we did, right? Hines is doing 10 in about 5 years. That's probably the right rate. And we need probably another 10 or 15 to make this into a really good business. So we're not even there yet. But everybody kind of knows that that's where we're going. And actually it was a very different conversation back then. Getting people to understand that shorter leases, not as much space, but also like a lot more amenitized or like nicer space, newer space is the thing that most people would go for. But 2019, we had a very hard time, actually even post-COVID. Real estate industry is notorious for like this idea of pretend and extend, emphasis on pretend. They thought this would change. I think a lot of them are still thinking that this is gonna blow over. Vacancies, are gonna go back up. And I am not convinced on, in that at all. I think the industry is not there, and that's why for Hines, again, scaling is kind of a scary word a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But they do have the playbook. I think, if you think about how the firm got started and this idea of partnering with institutions in the right times around the right things, that's what they do really well. And they actually are pretty well capitalized at this point to like make the most out of this. But we're super, like, every owner right now is freaking out, and they should. Like, cities are kind of screwed. I think we're talking, I look at cities like each one is like its own snowflake. Seriously. It's very hard to compare cities, and I've been trying for a while to figure out what is transferable between like all of these different, because it's all an urban core, right? So theoretically, it should look the same, just like your bedroom should probably be similar to mine. But I'm learning that's really not. At least I can't figure it out yet. Maybe the next time we have this podcast, I have totally nailed it. I know you guys are looking for me as the answer, so I'll try and justify that.
Yeah, you're saying that you're trying to figure out a continuity between cities in terms of the economic performance of real estate, or just in general in terms of their makeup.
Totally the first one, which is, so my biggest obsession since grad school, and probably before, was about figuring out how to turn offices into housing. It's just such a simple and yet complex proposition that it blew my mind. I was so obsessed with it that when, Andrea, who ran the lab, kind of like gently offered that I'll, do my graduate work on the thing that helps the lab, I was too obsessed to say, anything but no, I'm going to do this thing about offices and how they may or may not be suitable for housing. Again, no COVID.
Office to resi, and this was before COVID, right?
Yeah. This is pre-COVID. It was just before.
You're like you're predicting the future.
I was totally predicting.
Yeah, I told you. Oracle is here.
The Oracle was there, presented his thesis about, how office is basically fucked and what we could do about it. And I presented it in front of a ton of people, including everybody from JLL who supported me and supported the lab. And they all thought I was crazy. It's $220 a square foot at the time for office, Class A. Everybody's, what are you talking about? There is no vacancy problem.
Yeah, so, it's against their own interests to think that way. Yeah.
It's just unimaginable.
Yeah, and in context, you're talking about rental revenue from office space. In context, the residential revenue back then, even the high-end ones were like $5 per square foot per month, which is what, like $60? So we're talking about 200 versus 60. So it's like a no-brainer.
It's huge crap. So, but you can also draw the shape pretty clearly, which is like, at this point, my argument, the opening to the thesis was, real estate, if we know one thing about it, is that it's cyclical. So eventually there will be a crash. Eventually the urban core will like deflate and then gets repopulated in a sense. Like that is bound to happen because it's just too much office. It just doesn't make sense. So it's a matter of time, which, was true. But, when I think about it, it actually happened to me again. And that's why my kind of current philosophy is that it's worse to be early than right, which happened to me twice. So the second time this happened to me, when I was basically saying something that was too much into the future for like people to care. That happened to me with one of Hines' like most senior people. I was on a call with him when I had first rejoined after my thesis or after I graduated. And I kind of shifted roles within Hines to do something around entrepreneurship. And so I'm having this call with a super senior guy. And I think, I probably lost sleep over it. I was very excited for it. And on the call, I kind of decided on the fly that I got to share my biggest insight with him. So I went like, Mr. Steinbach, who's like the global, investment officer of the firm. You're not going to believe me, but AI is coming. I have seen the future. I totally believe that we're going to see something like a giant GPT, and it's going to take over. David Steinbach, you manage billions of dollars. Here's a diagram of where I would put money. I swear. And you know what he said? That's great, Yair. What can you tell me about blockchain? Because we're in 2020 and everybody wants to talk about it. infrastructure.
That was the thing of the topic du jour.
It doesn't matter that I'm right. It really doesn't.
Yeah.
Being early sucks. So this is why grad school is hard, because grad school is kind of being in the future. Tell me I'm wrong. I don't know.
No, that's the speed of the industry, right? The now, what is
That's a good point.
now matters, and that only matters because now you got to make the decision about the now, and then that leads you to the next one, even though you know what may happen. It's not their reality now, so it gets kind of pushed back.
Yeah, it's a kind of issue with real estate, urbanism in general. Like, we're always focusing on what we can do at the moment, but these things live on, and buildings live on way beyond maybe our careers, maybe our lifespan too. So it is difficult, I would say, both from an architectural standpoint, but also from planning and real estate standpoint, to balance between what we need to invest in now versus what we need to plan for the future. And then you have a black swan event like COVID, which just throws everyone for a loop. And I totally agree with you, Yair. I'm still talking to landlords who don't admit that this isn't changing. This isn't going back to 2018, 2019. Like, there is a fundamental shift, and maybe it's our generation. We can see this because we've been through a couple of these crises before, and maybe we're also in the position where we want to take advantage of it, and we don't have to. We don't want to. We don't want to necessarily. We're not afraid of the risk, but it is a different situation than I think a lot of people think it is.
Totally.
Yeah, so I kind of want to ask, is like, Alex and I went to school in Houston, and there's very few big names you hear in Houston, right? Hines is one of them, right? Love It, you mentioned, also a huge name in Houston. Can you give us a little bit of background, like, what is the history of Hines, and where is it today? Like, what kind of company is Hines in 2024?
It's a co-working company.
Oh, right. Totally. Oh my God. Hines is actually changing in a big way. So when you think of Hines, the picture you should have in your brain, in a lot of ways, is Succession in a little bit, but in a good way. Okay, so like the good version of Succession, where there's 3 generations essentially, right? There's the founder, there's the scaler, and then there's the 3rd generation, which I don't know. I guess they're the big changers. But so mapped that way, I think actually the founder maps well in this kind of scenario. So this is kind of the guy who came from nowhere, Indiana, and built $100 billion real estate empire. It's kind of nuts. And he loved architecture, right? There's stories to this day here in U of H, where my wife's a professor, where he would come to crits and like fall asleep during presentations. Stuff like
Gerald
that.
B. Hines, right?
That's right. In your thesis tomorrow. How fun is that?
The School of Architecture is also named after.
Totally. And he only paid $6 million, I think, and got that in perpetuity. The man knows how to get a good deal. That's a good deal. And I think that's how he got started. He made really good deals. One of his, I think the favorite one is probably like, here with kind of downtown, but then Williams Tower. It's probably the boldest move I've seen, like talking about giving the middle finger to the urban core. What is Williams Tower if not that? That is such a spectacular building in my brain. I think it's so well known. Like if you say Galleria, you literally see, right, this Tower of Death. And I had an office.
It looks like Lord of the Rings,
floor. And my biggest favorite joke about Williams Tower is that from the top of the building, you can see the curvature of the earth because it is so massive.
But it's like the most Houston building ever. Just this giant tower in the middle of nowhere.
That's Gerald Hines. That's his personality. And then came his son. And his son is actually the one who figured out how to unlock institutional capital at scale, how to do it really well. And so what he did is he partnered with a lot of the big banks, think like Morgan Stanley, big institution, big pension funds. That was really the unlock. And then this idea that you can not only do like JVs, right, like these local projects, you can manage a fund and then deploy at the fund scale, which is, adding a couple more zeros. That really scaled the firm. And when you can do it really well internationally, then you can get really high-end products. So for the longest time, Hines was really about office. In a lot of ways, I think the DNA is still office. But if you think about it, the last 5 years, most of the portfolio has already shifted to resi, to multifamily, right? A couple of big acquisitions, not a straightforward shot, but a big portion of the portfolio now is industrial and residential, over 33%. That was a huge deal. This was not true 10 years ago. And they did see a lot of the risk, I think, and that's why they actually, diversified. Maybe not too early, my God. But I still think, there's going to be winners and losers, right? Talked about, are we at the bottom? I'm interested to know if you think we've hit the bottom or not. And if what you're seeing, again, relative to different regions, different areas. It's kind of hard to trust the data, I feel like, right now with long-term leases and stuff like that. But what I see is that bottom is not here. It might be in Europe, but it's not in the US, not yet. And so if you have a pile of money and you're going to go out and buy, then you might be looking at late this year, but probably not the next quarter. But you tell me, do you see all comes down to rates? And I think there's a big bet around that, which I know I'm personally willing to take. But if you're Hines, you're gonna have multiple strategies.
Yeah, Hines, you said, specializes in office space for a long time. Now that you have a more diversified portfolio, but the majority, I assume, is still in office. What do you sense that Hines is planning? Are there in any way, shape, or form looking into conversions, like you said before?
No, absolutely not. Conversions are really hard and super expensive, and frankly, they just don't make sense yet. They will, maybe eventually. It depends, right? But so Hines has one massive adaptive reuse office conversion right now. It's actually a gorgeous building, and they just broke ground. I think it's going to end up, being fully leased in probably a year and a half from now. Recladded. It's in Utah, so Salt Lake, gorgeous. But it was so painful that I don't think, Hines will do it again anytime soon. These things are hard, man.
What do you think would need to change for it to become more feasible?
So I think, look, there's some people who already figured it out, right? So Metroloft and the guy Nathan Berman, right? He figured it out, or at least he figured something about it that makes it work a lot better than everybody else. And I've done a lot of research around him and what he does well versus where he could improve, at least in terms of modernizing. But what I came to realize is probably his biggest benefit, beyond the fact that he knows how to do business in New York, which is super hard by itself, but also just having the lower rate per square foot to build, right? So he has scale around manufacturing. That's a huge one. So if you could build for 220 and not 320, it's a huge difference. And so that really helps them, I think. So for Hines, we don't have that. That's not part of the DNA. Actually, what Hines does really well is, ground up, but pretty sustainable, but with a pretty relatively low impact, but not conversions, not really.
So how's the office managed? We can think about an architecture firm that they have hundreds of staff, but I assume as a development firm, and also you also manage the properties. So the structure of the company might be, or not might be, but it will be very different. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. A good example is, again, Williams Tower, one of my favorite buildings here. And in Williams Tower, so Gerald Hines built it, and then sold it to an institution, Invesco, but then kept the position of managing that building 20, 30 years into it. And that makes the whole thing, make a lot of sense, right? You build this great product, you kind of fill it up, and then you sell it to an institution who just sits on it. Could be a REIT, could be whatever. And because you're such an expert on the building, you keep producing revenue off of it. It's great. It's a great model. That's the Hines DNA. And that's why they kind of overbuilt a lot on the engineering, making sure that really high-end HVAC that would stay for 60 years, that actually makes sense for that, if that's your strategy. And that is probably again like where they do really good work, which is if you think about South Station that's going to open soon, like you can pretty much guarantee that it will be very high quality
In Boston.
in Boston. So
Yeah, the South Station Tower that's going up now.
complex project, right? It's right on top of this like mass transit node in the city, and you're building super complex. I think what 1 million square foot, probably a little bit under, multi-use, billions of dollars. And it's not the only one, right? There's hundreds of them that Hines is either doing or, really trying to do.
So coming back to the data science question, so I imagine your role is not only working on the co-working arm, but you also have involvement in these development projects or actual buildings. Can you tell us a little bit more about your day-to-day or what type of work you're doing there?
Yeah, look, my day-to-day is that has nothing to do with buildings at all. So, yes, I did co-working for a while, but in 2020, Hines decided that. So another thing we did with the co-working at the same time was putting some bets on some startups. It was a cool idea at the time. Our pitch to Hines was, let's help Hines build a muscle around VC, which was very sexy. So you guys know Fifth Wall, right? Back then, not a lot of people actually did. So back then, so think about it this way: we were the seventh big name that Fifth Wall took money from. Right now, it's over 40. So we were like participants on Fund One. Okay, we did Fund 2 and 3, whatever. But we were one of the early ones on the Fifth Wall train, which we can argue the returns are this way or that way, but they grew exponentially pretty much with the industry, and we were on that rocket ship with them for a while. So Hines did VTS as a deal and a couple others that turned out pretty well. And so what that did for the firm, along with the co-working thing, is can we kind of scale that up? And what that looks like is like a new venture arm for Hines. What would that look like? And so what we did about 2 years ago, a little bit over it from this point, is how do we launch new businesses with the support of the mothership being Hines as the kind of main funder and beneficiary of these ventures, how we can build these small teams that would kind of go independently and fuel from the mothership, but build super scale projects that, again, ventures that would run themselves. And so we did 4 of them. Right now, there are 4 ventures. There's about probably 50 people working across all teams. And I was lucky enough to be the first person on that team. So I got to see it from the ground up. And these 4 ventures are really about these 4 core verticals that the firm's interested about. One's around kind of AI, because of course. One's around crypto, because of course. The third one is around decarbonization, especially in Europe. And the last one's around community, which is pretty interesting. By itself, separate from the Square, this other brand called Fabric, run by a couple really interesting people that kind of use, more amenitized space in the building in maybe less traditional ways. And so, yeah, building that. These are 4 highly high-performing teams that run these ventures all across the world, pretty much.
So when you say venture, like, do you mean these are like, I guess, software startups, or like, is there a different way that these ventures are initiated or operated because they come from?
So each one's built just the way you're thinking. There's like a general manager, there's head of marketing, there's a front end guy, a back end guy, and a product manager owner, right? It's been 5 per each, and then you scale that as you need. You bring in a separate like GTM team to kind of like run campaigns on wherever and support on HubSpot and stuff like that. So kind of cold outreach and marketing is taking off of the local teams, and then each one runs really, really fast, which means you put out something out there, right? Like a couple landing pages, something that looks real nice, and just measure how much engagement you get on the idea. So at the time we tested like building spec suites and, it's crazy shit, just whatever. And then you measure how, like, basically what's the cost of acquisition customer, right? The lower it is, the hotter your idea. And so that way we really landed on like these ideas. So First one was like, can we do marketing for large CRE really well? Marketing's kind of screwed up right now for CRE, not because, well, first because everybody's desperate because space is not moving, but also you kind of need to hire an agency and bring in a photographer. Cost a lot of money. Making something that would solve it is pretty cheap now, right? With all the models and stuff. So that's bet one. It's a big bet, pretty large bet. We have a good team, I think, working on it, like both kind of on the business side and on the technical side. But it's also like an open sea. There's no moat on these things. Like it could go any direction at any time. I think that's a good bet. The other team that I really like, they're called Sequel. They're an even larger team, and what they're doing, so they're based most of them in the UK. The idea is, can we own a marketplace for decarbonization solutions? Everything from your HVAC to solar panels to whatever it is, we have a database, we'll hook you up, right, with the right providers. Sounds great, actually really, really challenging, not only because it's not unique, there's again no moat around the idea, but getting in front of the right people is not, it's again for a team that's really resource constrained, talking to everybody is not really how you're going to get deals done, not at the order of magnitude that you need. That's the current problem that they're solving. Will they get it? I don't know. They might get it. They're pretty smart, so I would say it's definitely worth a shot. And these are just two examples, right? I said there's four, so I don't know how many of them you want to hear about, but
I guess
they're all
imagine a marketplace product, like it's all about getting to the right size where you have kind of an ecosystem that works with each other. But I do imagine there is some advantage to being attached to Hines in that case, right? Because you have all these pre-existing buildings, pre-existing connections. Like, is that the kind of synergy you go after when you choose these ventures? Or are you kind of like, hey, like, let's just test this, and if it exists independent of the mothership and it can be successful, then go?
It's super hard, right? The good thing is I'm actually not in the position to even care about that because I'm not a senior management director, right? That's the benefit of being in my role, which is like somewhere between the nerd that comes to sales call to say like, I'm from MIT, so you should hang out, or talk to like basically hire a lot, right? Like make sure that you are good in the way that you communicate, mainly through code, because the last thing I want is more meetings. Like I'm trying to work with people who can deliver asynchronously. It's very important. That's how we run the teams. We're a global firm. And frankly, I think that's where we're all going. Happy to do an on-site, sure. We could come once a quarter, all of us together, but the rest of the time, as long as you produce what you write your own tickets and you do them, that's great in my book. Like that's the kind of people I work with, which I also really enjoy because I get to learn, right? Like that maybe I live in the past and not the future, which does happen. You think, Yair, you must be in the future always. Not true, guys. Some things I told you I just discovered Tailwind, right? That's a big one for me. It turned out that I'm not in the future on all things. So that's where I like to spend my time on.
So it's interesting that you're now working with tech software startup companies that are all related to real estate, right? And it is, if you think about it, it's actually a perfect blend of your experience as an architect, as a data scientist, trained data scientist at MIT, and then working at this global real estate firm. Where are you headed next? And what motivates you now?
I think there's still the number one obsession, which has nothing to do with the kind of like the reality of the day to day, which is converting buildings. It's just too exciting. So my brain will not probably let that go anytime soon. But I also think that that's where it should probably stay, right? It's kind of like a fun extracurriculum, basically. It's not something necessarily worth a career, even though, right, I do think that actually writing software for that is really interesting and is something I'm actively working on, right? So right now when I'm talking to you, I'm also staring at this piece of code at the back, right? Which is like my fun little secret project about how to make conversions work. Totally. I think career-wise, it's super hard to say. I think because it's such a local play, there's kind of two ways, I think. There's a two-way two-door scenario here. I guess like one-way door versus a two-way door. That's the right expression. Which means I can keep playing at the level of like the portfolio where you don't have to deal with actual real estate, with a city, right, with a place. It's kind of fun. It's pretty abstract. It sounds like that's what you guys are doing, except Minku. He might be the outlier. So there is something fun about that. But I also think my history with like building buildings like the one in Tel Aviv, and that was just one example, like that's so exciting to me. I want to do that, but I also think we get to live like as architects probably a long time. So it might be that I only do architecture at a much later stage.
Yeah, so you're keeping the doors open. And I'm also sure that a lot of listeners who are thinking about transitioning or learning more new skills in code and data science, what would be, as a person who have already done that, do you have any like recommendations or pointers or things that you want to tell the listeners?
Look, you know what the secret is? The secret is going to MIT. Like, is that doable for most people? Of course not. But that is by far the biggest driver of my career was getting in. So much so that I've been meaning to like write more about it, right? Like help others that are maybe even back in Israel, right? And I get a ton of people from Israel who are like, hey, how do I do that, right? I think there's a lot of ways to help there. Is that something I'm actively doing? Doing too many things is hard enough.
You're saying the environment really encouraged you to kind of
By far the largest
develop
component. By far, exactly right. It's like the environment. So being part of a really strong group, and then just kind of making sure you're tracking at least in that direction. Super helpful.
Well, I think you talk about kind of the built environment in a way that most people don't. We think a lot of times in terms of, at least as architects, we think in terms of the building is here, this block is this big, and you're talking about it in terms of kind of a very virtual set of concerns, which is quite interesting. But I think also extremely prescient because, as Minku mentioned, you've already tracked your career along architecture into kind of the virtualization of the physical world. And I think it's only going to get more virtual in some capacities, yet we're also going to have to kind of come back and make sure that the physical objects and the assets are still maintained and dealt with correctly. So there's this kind of dual role, which seems like you're able to straddle at least right now, or maybe you want to go back into the physical environment later on. I mean, Lebo, for instance, has gone from architect who codes. And, Lebo can talk more about it, but there's a lot of people out there who are trying to figure out what are those things that aren't taught in traditional architecture education that will supplement the things that will be necessary in the future.
Is Hines hiring architects?
Hines has a huge department of engineers called CCG. So that's the Conceptual Construction Group. The point that they have conceptual in there is really a bad description of what they do. There's nothing conceptual about it. They just look at like plans all day, basically. But they are also living in the past. So we have 0 Revit licenses at Hines, okay? We may have a couple of like AutoCADs, but everything is done exactly how you would imagine, which is paper and email, basically.
Really? Well,
yeah, it's kind of shocking. Yeah, it's coming, right? But it might take, again, a while. I think the 3rd generation now of Hines, there's 4 kids, and then 3 of them are actively involved in the day-to-day business. I think they have a really sharp vision across all of like the big verticals. They are placing some big bets, right? You can imagine what the overhead for these ventures I'm talking about, and it's not just the ventures, right? It's everything around it. This is, this is a big undertaking, not something that I think I see a lot of going on, frankly. And the fact that they are able to do this again without any external, there is no VC involved here, right? The firm owns all of it. It's really interesting. And so what I expect to happen is I expect Hines to do better. But I do think that always when there's a change in leadership, there's always a price to pay. And price is not equal on everybody, right? Ownership is going to have to make, I'm sure, some hard decisions. Again, I'm very lucky. I'm not in that direction. I'm not at that level. Like, I don't do executive meetings. Frankly, I don't think I'd be any good at it. I play Israeli really easily, so I really like, pushing buttons sometimes, and disagreeing comes really naturally to me. It's not a good thing when you're like, have a giant ship to steer. That's not great. But I learned that, right? And it probably took me a long time to learn that. And will I change? Maybe. But right now, I think I'm pretty effective, at least on this operational level. You talked a lot about like the theoretical and not the asset level, right, Alex? Where you said like you don't deal with assets. Maybe it's more abstract. It's funny because I feel like I'm in the mud almost, right? Like debugging all day, or pushing PRs to get up, whatever it is, right? Like this is grunt work, and that's kind of what I like, frankly. And it's funny, right? Because there's tons of grunt work for architects. That's literally 90% of the work for an architect is grunt work. The only difference is the number of zeros in your paycheck, and it's a big difference. So I'm just being honest, guys. Again, that's my kind of privilege, I guess.
No, I mean, what I think is really fascinating is that when I personally think about real estate, I think about it as a pretty old school industry that does things pretty slowly and methodically, but doesn't really try to innovate too much. But it does seem, at least from your story, Yair, that there is opportunity for that. Maybe it comes once there's a sort of succession across generations, or maybe it comes when the public or the industry just realizes things do need to change because the world and the context has changed around it. So I think it's completely fascinating that there is this other side of real estate, of the built environment, that is maybe not so physical at all, but it still involves data and still involves making decisions and still involves analysis, of course, which is what you do all the time. And that plays a huge role in terms of what actually gets built, occupied, rented, sold, and produced.